Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. This is our Remembrance and Advocacy webinar to mark 6 years of war in Yemen. My name is Danica. I'm the Yemen campaign coordinator at CodePink. Thank you so much for joining us. We have amazing speakers today like Dr. Aisha Jumaine, Mohamed Alwazir, Dr. Shireen Al-Adeimi, Medea Benjamin, and Hasan Atl. And now I'm going to pass it over to Kauthar from Yemeni Alliance Committee to kind of give us an overview of the war and why we're here today.
Welcome. My name is Kauthar Abdullah. I am the lead organizer of the Yemeni Alliance Committee. The Yemeni Alliance Committee, also known as the Yemeni YAC, was formed after the first Muslim ban to support Yemeni American communities in the Bay Area during periods of social unrest. The Yemeni Alliance Committee organizes protests and actions, coordinates congressional visits, creates social media toolkits and campaigns to resist anti-Yemeni policies. YAC's focus recently has been advocating to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen by raising awareness and pushing legislation in addition to repealing the ban. Through YAC's advocacy and organizing, we aim to equip our communities and allies with the tools to challenge harmful national security and foreign policies that impact Yemeni Americans and their families here and in our homeland. As Danica said, we are here to remember the war on Yemen, 6 years anniversary. To recap, on the eve of March 26, 2015, 6 years ago, Saudi Arabia, under the leadership of MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who had only been in power for a few months, launched airstrikes on Yemen, abruptly escalating a civil war into a regional inferno. And since then, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and its coalition, which includes the Arab countries of Kuwait, Bahrain, Sudan, Egypt, Morocco, Senegal, have been bombing Yemen. The coalition is backed and supported by the US, the UK, and other partners who have been providing the coalition with. The US trains Saudi forces. We also maintain, repair, and upgrade the coalition's vehicles and aircrafts. We provide intelligence support and targeting assistance. There have also been Green Berets, US Special Forces at Saudi-Yemen border. The investigation began as a mission that's supposed to be temporary, to last for a few months. It was called Operation Divisive Storm. It has not been a civil war since 2015. It's also not a sectarian war, as pundits have referred to it. A lot of people hear about the war, the clashes, yet I believe the most brutal part of this war that receives very little attention is the blockade. The coalition imposed a naval, land, and air blockade on Yemen since the conflict began in March 2015, which has severely restricted the flow of food, fuel, and medicine to civilians. It continues to prevent much aid and nearly all commercial airports from reaching Houthi-controlled ports, which has had a disproportionate impact on civilians' access to essential goods. The coalition's military strategy in Yemen has been increasingly built around preventing desperately needed aid and essential goods from reaching civilians, risking millions of lives. This amounts to economic warfare, which is backed and reinforced by the US Navy. Yemen depends heavily on imported food and medicine and fuel for 80 to 90% of the population's needs. The only airport available for Yemenis to travel out of Yemen is in Sayoun, which is in the south, and is a long journey by car and bus, and hardly anyone has the means and health to travel there. When we hear the world's worst humanitarian crisis in the century that we've seen in decades, even before the war, Yemenis lived on $2 a day. We can see why. In addition to military support, the United States, under the Obama administration, provided the coalition with weapons from US-made bomb manufacturers such as Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Boeing. There have been over 120 armed contracts, totaling $120 million a month. Since Biden took office, he promised Yemeni Americans two things: to rescind the unconstitutional Muslim ban and to end U.S. support for the war in Yemen. On day one, Biden rescinded the Muslim ban, which separated families for almost 4 years. So that's a good first step. Last month, in February, Biden finally announced that the US would end support for the war on Yemen. But there was also mention that will end all is offensive military support. Reminds me when we heard the Obama admin refer to the support that the US provides the coalition was only a defensive one back in 2015. Many folks have been under the impression that the US has stopped supporting war crimes on Yemen any longer. Today, we'll hear what that means, what has changed, and what you can do to join the anti-war movement. So, what does ending offensive support mean? We heard that John Kirby, Pentagon press secretary, saying that the existing non-combat US intelligence support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen has been terminated as a result of President Biden's order to cease support for offensive operations, confirming that the US was providing intel sharing support for coalition operations inside of Yemen, and that has now ceased. The Biden administration has made severely positive policy shifts on Yemen so far to help bring this conflict to end, including lifting the Foreign Terrorist Organization, FTO, designation of the Houthis, imposed at last minute by former President Donald Trump. The new administration has also moved to halt US military support, participation in weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for offensive operations, and appointed a special envoy to Yemen. But if President Joe Biden is serious about delivering on his promise to step up diplomacy to end the war in Yemen, more must be done. So, with further ado, I will introduce our very first speaker, Dr. Aisha Jumaine.
Really quickly, Kauthar, we are actually playing the CNN clip really quickly. Okay. To give people a little context for the blockade. And thank you, Kauthar, for that very thorough background on what's happening in Yemen. Recently, CNN did a report on the situation at Hodeidah port. So I will show everyone that 1-minute clip.
Well, firstly, I should say we have not received any response from Saudi Arabia, whom we put our findings to. We did, however, receive a response from Tim Lenderking, who is the newly appointed US envoy to Yemen, and he told us this is a complex environment, but he denies the claims that we show in that report. He says that those boats are currently off the port of Hodeidah, and Jake, that's just not true. He also says that food continues to flow through Hodeidah unimpeded, and also that is just not true. You saw those food trucks along the side of that road. He says the US is committed to push the parties towards peace. And the question that we have for him is, how is that possible when you are not acknowledging the full impact of that US-backed Saudi embargo on the people of Yemen, Jake?
Thank you. And now I will let Kauthar introduce Aisha.
Thank you for that. That was a very powerful video. So our first speaker is Aisha. Dr. Aisha is the founder and president of the Yemeni Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, a nonprofit charity organization that aims to provide relief to the people of Yemen and support building efforts. She manages and coordinates health-funded projects in Yemen, including the Field Epidemiology Training Program, the FETP, and support for public health laboratories. Prior to this, Dr. Aisha was a consultant for CDC, the FET program supporting programs in the Middle East. Aisha holds a PhD in ophthalmology from the University of North Carolina and an MPH in ophthalmology from Emory University and a BA in biology from Mills College. So, Dr. Aisha, what does the situation on the ground look like, and how have that changed due to COVID?
Kauthar, thank you. I have a few slides, and then I'm going to answer your question on COVID. And I do have a few slides on COVID-19. I'll just go over some slides very fast. I always like to start my slides with a picture of the old city of Sana'a. This is my city. And just to remind people how beautiful Yemen is, and that Yemen has a lot of history. This is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world and is a UNESCO heritage site. Looking at the number of people who are in need by 2021, we see that there are 16.2 million people who are food insecure in Yemen, 20 million people in Yemen who need health care, and 15 million people who need water and sanitation, and about 16 million people who need protection. Many of you have heard about the famine. It's been on the news quite a bit. This is from the WFP, which is the World Food Program's, one child dying every 75 seconds in Yemen, as Yemen is at the brink of famine. This is from David Beasley, also, who is the chief of WFP. He said, I can't say this enough. When the famine has arrived, we're too late. Lives have already been lost. Without urgent intervention in Yemen this year, we risk losing one child every 75 seconds. Another one, Yemeni are starving for food, for fuel, for medical supplies, and for hope. Another one, no food, no fuel, no end in sight. So there is also a UN publication that comes out. This is the one that just came out, and it talks about the blockade. First time, very specifically. The blockade has not been talked about at all, not in the UN community, not in the aid community, and not in the media in the US. And basically, it says the blockade and the conflict has had a heavy toll on Yemen's economy. And without lifting the blockade, the situation in Yemen is going to get worse. And that Yemen has lost 181 billion if the conflict continues into 2022. Imagine how much loss Yemen has had through this conflict and blockade. Famine has arrived in pockets of Yemen. Saudi ships blocking fuel aren't helping. And I know that Mohamed will talk more about this. I'll leave this to Mohamed. This is from the UN Secretary for Humanitarian Affairs, Mark Lowcock, also briefing the Security Council on the blockade on Yemen and its impact and how the fuel prices have increased. Health facilities are closing, and there are so many ships that are not being allowed to get into Yemen. We heard yesterday the first fuel ship got into Yemen. There is nothing to celebrate. We should not be having a blockade in the first place. In terms of COVID-19, unfortunately, COVID has now resurged in Yemen, and it is overwhelming the medical system in Yemen. This shows the curve of the cases from the very first wave of COVID-19, and in Arabic, we go from right to left. So at the height of the first wave, we saw about 250 cases per week, right? And the steepness of the curve is not as high as what we are seeing now. This is the second wave, and you can see we've exceeded the first wave, and the curve is quite steep. I also want to talk a little bit here about what the Saudis have announced, and the US State Department was very happy with it. The Saudi announced that they want to have, a peace process in Yemen. However, since they have announced that, there are a few things that have happened. As with previous ceasefires, this is from Yemen Data Project. So since Monday, when they said they're going to have a ceasefire, they've had 8 raids, 5 in Marib, 2 in Hajjah, 1 in Jof, and 1 in the capital, Sana'a, hitting the airport. I want here to emphasize that advocacy works. There are 2 times, these are the airstrikes from 2015 until now. And the only 2 times where there was a huge reduction in airstrikes was here, October 2016, after the funeral attack, home attack, and here in October 2018, after Khashoggi's killing. So anytime Saudi are in the news and people are talking about their atrocities, we see an impact on the airstrikes on Yemeni people. So my call for action is that we need to end the blockade and open all points of entry to Yemen, and this should not be linked to the peace negotiation. The Yemeni people should not be held hostage to peace negotiation. Increase the humanitarian aid to Yemen, especially from Saudi and UAE. They need to pay their fair share, introduce a balanced UN Security Council resolution, and support a just peace. And I'm happy to answer any questions, maybe after other people get a chance to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Aisha, for your wonderful presentation. Our next speaker is Mohamed Alwazir. Mohamed is the legal director of Arabian Rights Watch Association, or ARWA, where he focuses on international humanitarian law and participates in United Nations Human Rights Council sessions. Mohamed will speak about the blockade as it relates to the prospects of peace in Yemen.
Okay, thank you, Danaka, for that introduction and the invitation to speak at this event, which comes on a day marking the beginning of 7 years of war on Yemen. I've been following the advocacy the panel speakers have been engaged in here in the US, and am humbled by your dedication to bring peace to Yemen and the region, and ultimately for speaking truth to the powers that be. I will just start out by speaking briefly on the peace initiatives that were proposed over the past year by the UN, US, and most recently Saudi Arabia. And then we'll go over the blockade, which is at the center of the parties' differing stances on the prospects for peace. So back in June 2020, the UN Special Envoy announced an initiative called the Joint Declaration, which had 3 general tracts. And I'll go over these tracks with you. There was a military track involving a comprehensive ceasefire involving airstrikes and ground fighting by both sides, and the establishment of a committee led by the UN to oversee that ceasefire. The second track was a humanitarian economic track involving the opening of Sana'a International Airport, opening all seaports, including Hodeidah, Ras Al Isa, and Salif seaports, to all UN permitted ships. Also, it involved fixing the Ma'rib Ras Al Isa pipeline to resume oil transport from Ma'rib all the way to Ras Al Isa in an underwater pipe to the Safar tanker, and then onwards to other tankers. And lastly, it involved placing all revenues of the state in a joint account within the central bank in order to pay for public sector salaries. This would also include depositing the proceeds of the sale of oil extracted from the Safar tanker once it was maintained and sold. And lastly, there was a political track. So you had a military track, a humanitarian economic track, and then a political track involving resumption of negotiations on a lasting peace made possible by a political settlement. And then there was other matters in this joint declaration that dealt with releasing all prisoners, those who are arbitrarily detained or disappeared, or those who are under house arrest from either side. Although the declaration itself was never signed by the parties, it formed the basis of backdoor discussions that occurred all throughout the last 6 or 7 months. So on the one hand, you have the Hadi government, which is concerned with its legitimacy and ultimately its authority. They demanded control over passenger air travel. So they wanted to know they wanted to have control over the lists of passengers who are flying in and out. And they wanted control over the central bank and the distribution of its deposits. preferring it to be set up in Aden, the Aden branch of the central bank, rather than the Hodeidah branch. This was part of the reason why this was not implemented in the Stockholm Agreement in December 2018 up until now, because there was this whole argument over who controls the bank account and who is the sole legitimate authority to do so. On the other hand, you have the de facto authority in Sana'a, who are of the position that the humanitarian economic track, as Dr. Aisha mentioned, should be prioritized given the dire humanitarian situation. Their viewpoint is that the humanitarian aid and commercial shipments are actual rights of the people and should not be used as a card to influence the military and political tracks. So from a military standpoint, it seems that the de facto authority in Sana'a does not want to sign off on a ceasefire, tying its hands behind its back, while the blockade is in effect starving millions. So Sana'a is now demanding, it's actually demanding now, that the humanitarian file be treated separately from the military and political files. The stance also comes at a time when the de facto authority in Sana'a perceives itself to be in a stronger position than before, given its tested and increasing ability to strike military targets deep inside coalition territory, and its continued advance on the ground, reclaiming territory that the coalition previously controlled. So, and that's why you had this announcement, but you still see the fighting occurring because there's really no agreement or a change in position over the last 9 months. So here we are. In came the U.S. Special Envoy, Tim Lenderking, with a proposal echoing the terms of the joint declaration, and then the subsequent proposal by Saudi Arabia, which pretty much echoed the same. And here we are, human rights advocates and humanitarians, watching the humanitarian situation worsen in Yemen as the blockade remains and as officials deny it even exists. So this brings me to the main topic I wanted to share with you, the blockade, which is at the center of whether or not a peace settlement can be achieved at the moment. And because the blockade is being denied, it's an opportune time to discuss the development of UN stances with respect to the blockade over the course of the war. As we all know, 6 years ago today, on March 26, 2015, the US-backed Saudi coalition launched an unlawful war on Yemen, employing unlawful airstrikes against civilians and civilian infrastructure, and imposing an unlawful aerial and naval blockade. During the first 2 years of war, the number of deaths caused by the blockade was neglected by the UN and media outlets, who instead were fixated on airstrikes that killed 10,000. I'm sure you all remember that number, 10,000, which remained unchanged year on year. Well, here's a little Google search, Yemen, 10,000 civilian casualties, UN says, and you'll find that, up until January 2017, 2 years after the war, the number was at 10,000 deaths. So we set, as a group at ARWA, we wanted to change that. So what we did was in April 2016, and throughout that year, our team submitted 5 complaints on the unlawful blockade to the UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures. And the Special Rapporteurs on food, health, water, and international democratic order. We submitted another 2 related complaints at the beginning of 2017 as well, to total 7. The complaints can be summarized in the following chart, which shows about a 50% decline in food, medicine, and fuel imports in the first 2 years of the war. And that's where you got that number, I think it was 15 million. If you have 30 million people in the population, you have a 50% decline in imports. 90% of the country's needs are done by imports. So basically they had that 50 million number. 50 million people, were now without food, medicine, and fuel. So I'm having a problem switching. Okay, here we go. So during 2016, and after receiving complaints to the UN special procedures, 4 UN special rapporteurs began investigating the allegations regarding the blockade. By corresponding with the Saudi Arabian government, in which they stated in a letter dated November 16, regarding the aerial and naval blockade, it is reported that humanitarian aid into Yemen is being hampered by a variety of regulatory or even apparently in some cases arbitrary impediments from the coalition. There is a long list of vessels waiting to enter the ports of Yemen, and sometimes those which have already entered the port are removed from the dock before unloading the goods. Moreover, there is an unreasonable delay and/or denial of entry to vessels that have been inspected and proven to not be carrying weapons, and also for those that are not suspected of carrying weapons. It goes on to state that the blockade of Yemen is reported to have entailed serious humanitarian and socioeconomic consequences on the Yemeni people. And as summarized by the panel of experts on Yemen, the systematic and widespread blockade of commercial goods has directly contributed to the obstruction of deliveries of aid and humanitarian assistance, while restricting vital imports of commercial fuel, food, and other goods, not within the purview of Resolution 2216. So in December 2016, we had the OSHA coordinator, Jamie McGoldrick, who was addressing the press at the time, who made that famous statement, at least one child dies every 10 minutes from preventable diseases in Yemen. So this was at the end of 2016. In January 2017, the Saudi government responded to the UN correspondence, admitting the following. The coalition to support legitimacy in Yemen has been careful to comply with international humanitarian and human rights law during all its military operations and its activities to assist the legitimate Yemeni government in enforcing the embargo on banned goods in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions. It also says that in order to protect the flow of commercial goods and foodstuffs into the country, the coalition has established an evacuation and humanitarian operations unit through which, in a timely fashion, it issues permits. The response also listed 9 multi-million-dollar UN projects Saudi Arabia was funding, and that part of the response was a lot longer than this. So there was a lot of focus on how much money the government gives the UN. And then in February 2017, we had this UNICEF tweet that 63,000 Yemeni children had died in 2016 from preventable causes, often linked to malnutrition. And in April 2017, the UN Special Rapporteur issued a press release demanding that the blockade be lifted. In it, they stated that the blockade involves a variety of regulatory, mostly arbitrary restrictions enforced by the coalition forces, including an unreasonable delay and/or denial of entry to vessels in Yemeni ports. Mr. Jazairi says it amounts to an unlawful unilateral coercive measure under international law. So in April 2018, or by April of 2018, 247,000 children had died from the lack of food, fuel, and medicine, according to local stats. In August 2018, the group of eminent experts' first report was issued concluding that the Saudi coalition aerial and naval restrictions amount to a de facto blockade. And the reason why they use de facto is that they categorize the war, as you know, as a civil war, an internal conflict, or a conflict of a non-international character. So the terminology blockade is not used under that category. It's only used under state-to-state warfare, conflict. And so they just called it a de facto blockade. It's a blockade, regardless. And so after that, after the group of eminent experts made it clear that it was a blockade, they mentioned in their report also that no searches by either the United Nations Verification and Inspection Mechanism or coalition forces have discovered weapons. They also said that no possible military advantage could justify such sustained and extreme suffering of millions of people. The coalition has failed to cancel or suspend the restrictions as required under international law. So, despite the knowledge of the blockade's effect on civilians, the group of eminent experts second report in 2019 failed to include the number of deaths the blockade had caused up to that time. And in its third report in 2020, the experts, not reflecting any proper investigation of their own, relegated the number of deaths of 130,000 that was projected by the UN development program to a footnote in one version, and then removed it in another. So footnote 7 disappeared. I'm not too sure what the reason was, but it could be that it wasn't confirmed yet. But later on, as we moved towards the end of the year, the UN made a statement relying on the UN development program projections, concluding that the number of deaths due to the blockade was more than those caused by airstrikes and ground fighting. It actually said that the war had already caused an estimated 233,000 deaths, including 131,000 from indirect causes, such as lack of food, health services, and infrastructure. So the truth is, there is a blockade. It's imposed on Yemen by a coalition of countries from the outset of the war that started 6 years ago, and which has resulted in the deaths of anywhere between 131,000 people to 250,000 civilians, and the suffering of the entire population of 30 million people, for the purposes of using starvation as a weapon of war to subjugate the Yemeni people and block their efforts at self-determination. The blockade not only exists, it amounts to war crimes, crimes of genocide, and crimes against humanity. If it is not lifted, the humanitarian situation in Yemen will most likely worsen, as will the prospects for peace, unfortunately. Thank you. With that, I yield the floor.
Can you stop sharing your screen? There's
Yes,
a red button on top. Thank you.
I'm trying to, where is it? There it is, okay. Did it stop?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, wonderful.
Our next speaker, thank you for that. It was very insightful. Our next speaker is Dr. Shireen. Dr. Shireen is an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University. Since 2015, she has played an active role in raising awareness about the Saudi-led war on her country of birth, Yemen, and works to encourage political action to end US support for the war. She writes for In These Times and has been featured on NBC, NPR, The New York Times, Al Jazeera, Current Affairs, The Nation, and others. Welcome, Dr. Shireen. Can you tell us what role does the U.S. play in the war on Yemen?
Thank you so much, Kauthar and Danica, for hosting this, and to all of the wonderful speakers for sharing your insights. I always learn something new, and I learned a lot from Mohamed's presentation just now. I hope everybody here did too, and thank you for everybody for taking time out of your Friday evening to join us today. This is a really painful kind of anniversary for us. It's a day that's marked by a lot of pain, and as much pain as we feel, of course, it's nothing compared to what people in Yemen, what our loved ones, what, humans in this other part of the world are going through. And so I just want to remember that, why we're doing all of this work, we're doing it for the civilians who continue to suffer needlessly. And I've been active in talking about the US's role specifically because citizen of the United States and Canada, and I'm concerned with what my government does here to perpetuate this war. There's not much I can do about what's happening internally in Yemen. There's not much anybody in here can do to do that, to influence that. But there's a lot we can do to influence our own governments. And so that's what I've been trying to shed over the last few years. The US is involved in Yemen in multiple ways. And by the way, for those of you who know me, you know I always have slides, but I don't have any today, so we'll just talk. The US is involved in Yemen in many, many ways and has been since the Obama administration. We're into the third administration now where this is still an active participation. This is a US, Saudi, UAE-led war. The US is part of the Saudi-led coalition, despite what people may read on Wikipedia. So much so that the Congress had passed a war powers resolution, the first of its kind, in 2019, urging President Trump to end hostilities in Yemen. And of course, he completely disregarded that and vetoed it. But why is the US even involved in Yemen? We talk about Yemen as being the poorest country and in the Middle East, and now among the poorest in the world. It has some oil production, but nowhere as significant as its neighbors in Saudi Arabia, for example. But right now what's relevant in the news is this tanker that's stuck at Suez Canal, right? So people are watching this tanker and it's completely stuck, and you're seeing these maps of all of these, this backlog that is created. Well, if you just look down, right? If you look down the Red Sea, you'll see that the chokehold, another chokehold, is right at Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where Yemen controls. And so all of the traffic moving to Europe and to the United States and down to Asia is also going through Yemen. And so 6.2 million barrels of oil and oil products per day travel through Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And then, of course, there's shipping of all sorts of things that are not oil. And we see how much of an impact this vessel has had, and you can understand then the role that Yemen plays here. So the US has always had a strategic interest in the region for that reason and for other reasons. We also always hear about weapon sales, and we know that they're in the tens of billions of dollars under both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. But importantly, the US is involved in training Saudi and Emirati pilots and soldiers. They advise their military personnel. They provide targeting assistance from the command room. So imagine that. We have US commanders in the command room choosing targets alongside the Saudis. We repair and maintain, and I say we as the US government here, repairs and maintains vehicles and aircrafts that are possessed by the Saudi-led coalition, whether they were sold to them by the US or not. They also provide 73% of all of the arms that Saudi Arabia uses. And of course, they're only engaged in Yemen right now, so they've been using these weapons to bomb Yemeni civilians. Intelligence sharing has been a big part of the way that the US is involved in Yemen. Mid-air refueling stopped in late 2018, but the US used to provide mid-air fueling to Saudi and Emirati jets. They provide all sorts of logistical support, and importantly, they assist with this naval blockade. We've always suspected that the US assists with the late naval blockade. They never denied it, but they never confirmed it either. But some hints that it is in fact involved is, every now and then you'll hear reports saying that the US has intercepted some weapons that are meant to be shipped supposedly from Iran to the Houthis. And so, well, how would they know that they intercept? How would they intercept them if they're not actually in that area patrolling, enforcing this blockade, which UN Resolution 2216 essentially allows and calls for under this pretense of an arms embargo to the Houthis. But it has resulted in the Saudis and Emiratis and the US Navy basically blockading everything that goes in and using starvation as a weapon of war, as Mohamed has detailed. And the recent CNN investigation, by the way, was not denied by the Saudi-led coalition. When CNN said that this is a US-backed blockade on Yemen, this was not denied. What was denied was the existence of a blockade to begin with, which is, of course, ridiculous. We know that it's existed for 6 years, and you've just seen proof of that with Mohamed's presentation. So these are the ways that the US is involved. Under the Biden administration, he began by saying, well, in the campaign trail, he was saying that he was interested in just stopping all support for the US war. And I personally spoke with his senior advisor, national security advisor, and he said that all means everything. Because I said, is it just weapon sales that you're talking about? And he said, no, every form of support. We're ending all forms of support to the Saudi-led coalition. here we are in March of 2021, and it turns out that offensive operations have ended supposedly, but defensive operations continue, which again, like Kauthar mentioned earlier, this is very reminiscent of the of the Obama administration's framing of this war as defensive to begin with. They said they're protecting Saudi territory, and now Biden is saying he's protecting Saudi territory. Biden also announced that he is ending intelligence sharing, which is a big step. He undid some of the damage that the Trump administration did at the very last minute by designating the Houthis as foreign terrorists, which would have just been complete genocide, just starving the entire population of Yemen. And he said, I think I mentioned, he said that he ended intelligence sharing, and he's reviewing relevant arms sales. So what does this mean? Bombs are still being dropped on Yemen. These bombs are still being supported by the United States. We don't know if we stopped providing assistance with targeting. We don't know we know that the Saudi army and the U.S. army are still having joint exercises. So there's still support for the Saudi-led coalition in many, many ways. And I think what we want to see next is for Congress to take over this process and to not rely on a president who was part of the administration that started this war to begin with. Congress needs to be stepping in. Hassan will outline, I'm sure, all of the ways that we can push Congress to be involved. But this has to be done through congressional oversight. We can't rely on the executive branch's promises to just end this war that they thought it was a great idea to begin with in the first place. So that's where I'll end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shireen Al-Adeimi. Our next speaker is Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the women-led peace group CodePink and the co-founder of human rights group Global Exchange. She has been an advocate for social justice for more than 40 years, described as one of America's most committed and most effective fighters for human rights by New York Newsday, and one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement by the Los Angeles Times. She was one of 1,000 exemplary women from 140 countries nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the millions of women who do the essential work of peace worldwide. So Medea, how has CodePink and allies reacted to U.S. envoy Linda King's hypocritical statements on Yemen? And what have other U.S. efforts to end U.S. support looked like in Yemen, CodePink specific actions and otherwise since 2015?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this very sad anniversary and to be part of a panel with so many wonderful Yemeni Americans. And Danica, I wanted to go back further than that because I think that US crimes against the Yemeni people go back a lot further. And I'm gonna just take it from the time of 9/11 and the US war on terror. And when I talk about the work we did, I talk about a broad coalition. And I also want to recognize from early on that a lot of this work has been led by Yemeni Americans who've been extremely courageous and brilliant, as you hear tonight. If you go back to 9/11, some of the people on this call might remember all the men that were scooped up in the Middle East and thrown into prison in Guantanamo. And a lot of them were Yemenis. In fact, 115 of them were from Yemen, where they were held without trial, without any due process, without charges. At that time, a group of us started protesting the imprisonment of people in Guantanamo. And we actually went to Yemen, where we met with family members whose loved ones were in Guantanamo and heard horrible stories about what was happening to their family members. And we joined with them in protests, meeting with the US ambassador in Yemen, pushing for the US to call for the release of these Yemeni prisoners. But at the same time, we also met with people whose loved ones were killed by drone strikes. And this has been going on since that time. And you might recall that there was even a young American by the name of Abdul Rahman Al-Awlaki, who was killed by a drone strike we met with his family, and they told us how he was killed while he was eating at a restaurant, outdoor restaurant, with a group of his friends. And the only reason they could conjecture is that they didn't like his father. And I'll never forget the racist comment of Obama's press secretary at the time, Robert Gates, who said, well, he should have had a more responsible father. I say this because it just shows how US policy has been treating Yemenis as people whose lives are just not worth the lives of Americans, but there are even occasions where an American citizen, a 16-year-old, has been wiped out with no justification and no accountability. We brought that issue of the drone strikes and the Guantanamo imprisonment back to the US, interrupting Obama during a speech, going to the home of the head of the CIA, John Brennan, asking for, indeed, accountability. And it's just so tragically ironic when you hear the US Secretary of State today berate the Chinese for not following the rule of law, to remember how little the US respects the rule of law. And of course, we get to the 6 years of war where the US has allied with with a country that is so totally disrespectful of any rule of law, and that is Saudi Arabia. And it has been quite incredible to see the way that this broad coalition of groups working to stop the US support for the Saudi intervention in Yemen has managed.
Whoever's not muted, please mute yourself.
So
except for Medea, don't mute yourself.
I know somebody muted me. It was remarkable to see the broad coalition, and Hassan is a major part of this, that was created, that even got very conservative groups involved and managed in a Congress that's known for not being able to have anything bipartisan, actually passed a bipartisan war powers resolution that was then callously vetoed by Trump, who favored his relationship with Saudi Arabia over the lives of the Yemeni people. There's been so much good work done by this coalition in the US, even during COVID, when it's been very difficult to get out into the streets and do the kind of protests that we have been doing. There's been great campaigns over social media, great webinars, and a fabulous day of action, a global day of action on January 25th, when 230 organizations from 17 countries got together to say the world says no to the war in Yemen. So we have been protesting from the time of Bush, Obama, Trump, and now here we are under Biden. Danica, you asked about Lender King. I think, I know it was you who gave him the moniker Lying Lender King, for his refusal to even acknowledge that there was a blockade going on in Yemen. And we do have a petition that maybe we could put into the chat, calling on Lender King to apologize for his lies, and also then to openly be pushing the Saudis to stop the blockade and of course stop the war. The US, even under Biden now, continues to be so biased in favor of the Saudis. We saw even the State Department put out a statement today in which they chastised the Houthis for an attack in Saudi Arabia, where they say the Houthis are trying to block the free flow of fuel. But they don't chastise the Saudis for blocking the fuel to go into Yemen, and the Saudis for the terrible consequences of the blockade and the war. So I would just say that, Hassan will talk about some of the things that we are doing and must do, that it has been important to be part of this broad coalition for all of these years, and that as long as the war continues, as long as the blockade continues, as long as children continue to starve, and as long as our government remains complicit in all of these crimes, we must continue and do more to build up the opposition, because as we all know, Yemen can't wait. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the work that you do, for your organization's work. They've really been on the forefront with the Yemen Alliance Committee and many other anti-war organizations helping to end the war in Yemen and lift the blockade. So thank you. Our next speaker is Hasan Atl Hessen. Hassan is a legislative manager for the Middle East Policy with FCNL, Friends Committee on National Legislation, who played a key role on the policy end of the anti-war work. Welcome, Hassan. So can you tell us what has actually shifted since the new admin came into office?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to give a shout out to everyone that has spoke before me. It's a powerful coalition indeed. It goes all the way from the raging grannies to, to conservatives like Matt Gaetz and everybody in between. And I think a lot of people have just tried to set aside whatever other differences they have to come together to do this, shared goal of ending this horrible, horrible war that's gone on way too long and has claimed so many innocent lives and devastated, a country that just should never have been in this situation. I'm disgusted with, American involvement, and I've made it my goal to do everything I can every single day to try to end U.S. support for this war, whether it be the weapon sales, the intel sharing, the spare parts transfers, logistical support, and backing the Saudi blockade. So there have been some things that have happened, and Quathar, you mentioned several of them. One was ending U.S. support for offensive operations. Granted, we don't quite know what that means, but we heard that it means offensive intel sharing for airstrikes, lifting the FTO designation on the Houthis and SDGT designations, to make sure that humanitarian trade could flow into the country, and also the appointment of a U.S. Envoy to Yemen to try to help with diplomacy. But as folks mentioned earlier, that's not going so hot right now. I think it's really important that we're calling attention to the blockade. If I may, I just want to jump into that because I think it's the most urgent thing we can do right now. There are letters going around. There's a letter in Congress being led by Reps Dingell, Pocan, and Khanna. That's going to close on Monday. And I think everything we can do, I think it's probably going to get extended a little bit. So we have a bit more time. And I think there is a action link if somebody wants to share that in the chat. But I think that really should be the focus of our advocacy right now, is to make sure that we call out the blockade. And what the letter does that's being led by these members, it just calls on the Biden administration to publicly increase pressure on Saudi Arabia to lift this blockade immediately. And I know we've talked a lot about Saudi, but the UAE is part of this blockade. So we really should be saying lifting the Saudi UAE blockade on Yemen. I think that's really critical, something that we haven't talked enough about. So I think it's also really critical that we make sure that no military support is going to help this blockade along. We have to get the answers that we need from the administration to know what this actually, what defense articles we are providing. I think it's interesting today. We were supposed to get answers from the Biden administration from a letter that Rep. Ro Khanna and Rep. DeFazio sent. There was 13 questions. One of them was, what activities, if any, are we doing to support the blockade? What is offensive? What is defensive? We haven't gotten any word. It's past close of business here in Washington, D.C. I think that's a story in and of itself, that there was no reply to the Ro Khanna letter on all this stuff clarifying. Just a couple more things. I think, it's really important that folks call out what we need at the UN as well, which is a new UN Security Council resolution. And I think that's just really critical. So I'm going to read a little piece of what that UN Security Council resolution says, just to make sure that folks really understand. So the Saudi coalition has used the UN Security Council Resolution 2216 to really legitimize its offensive operations to maintain, and maintain international military support. Section 15, in particular, which under the auspices of trying to enforce a arms embargo on the country, has been used to, and I quote. It calls upon member states, in particular states neighboring to Yemen, to inspect all cargo to Yemen in their territory, including seaports and airports. And that has been used as justification to have this incredible, tight blockade for 6 years. And that's been a key driver of the starvation and devastation of millions of people in Yemen. So on top of just getting the Biden administration to put pressure on the Saudi-led coalition, the Saudi UAE-led coalition, to end the blockade on Yemen, we need a new UN Security Council resolution. So just want to lay out a couple things. So one, I think the first most immediate step we can all do is make sure our members of Congress hear from us about the Kana Dingle Pocan letter. And that was dropped in the chat. Everybody should fill that in. Send a note right to your member. You can customize it. I think that's really important to do. And call up your member, email them, share that action link with as many people as you can, and try to get them to take action by early next week. This is an immediate step. The next thing I think is really important is just to, make sure that your member is supporting, ending U.S. support for the Saudi UAE-led coalition later on in the year. Maybe we'll have another webinar around the summer when they're going to vote on the National Defense Authorization Act. But on top of just pushing the executive branch through letters and public statements, we can legislate a permanent end to military support and not rely on a flimsy executive order that could be overturned by this administration or by another one. So I believe that there's going to be another effort in the NDAA, or the National Defense Authorization Act, to legislate an end to U.S. military support, and we're going to make sure to put a clause in there to end any participation in the blockade too. So those two steps, I think, are really critical and things that we can all have agency over with. And I think, part of our job right now is not just for us to do the actions, but to be, evangelists out there, telling everybody we know, doubling down, being like Danica, standing in front of her member of Congress's office for the past 2 weeks in a hot dog costume, getting him to co-sponsor Medicare for All. That's a true story. She'll tell you all about it, I'm sure. But that kind of dedication is what we need right now. I got a message that we could do a war powers resolution. Absolutely. I think the blockade right now in the immediate term is more important to put key pressure on, because that's going to allow food, fuel, medicine to get into the country. And I think wind the war down. I think if we can end the blockade, it's going to be really difficult to sustain this war. So that's really, really key. But yes, I think, working with a war powers resolution, working, on committee hearings and working with the NDAA are all things that we can do. I look forward to your questions, and I just wanted to keep it kind of tight here and just make it action focused, because we got a lot to do here.
Thank you so much, Hassan. That was our last speaker for tonight, and I just want to thank our co-sponsors again, DSA San Francisco, DSA New York, CodePink, Action Corps, Yemeni Alliance Committee, Students for Yemen, Massachusetts Peace Action, ARWA, and Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for taking the time out of your day to be here with us. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. Just to reiterate our demands, we're demanding that Congress and President Biden end all arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, end all war support for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, ensure unconditional lifting of the blockade on Yemen and opening of all seaports and airports, provide adequate humanitarian aid for the people of Yemen, and you can call 1-833-STOP-WAR. That's 1-833-STOP-WAR to be connected to your members of Congress to make these demands. We're going to close out today with a very uplifting video from Middle East Eye about the January 25th Day of Action. So I will share our screen and it'll end with a call to action. So please stay tuned for that. And then the webinar's over after that. So thank you all and have a great night.
Oh, and follow our organizations to stay plugged in into what you can do in the next action item for efforts to stop the war on Yemen. Thank you all to our listeners, to our followers, to everyone who attended, and to the co-host Danica, and to our speakers.
And you can go to codepink.org/Yemen. It has all of our Yemen and Saudi focused petitions and actions there as well. All right, let me share this.
The UN quite rightly says it's the largest humanitarian disaster anywhere in the world. Just think about that for a moment. The largest humanitarian disaster anywhere in the world.
We will speak the truth about them and recognize that a Yemen baby has exactly the same value as a baby in Ethiopia, a baby in Guatemala, a baby in the American Empire, a baby in Greece, a baby in Tel Aviv, a baby in West Bank and Gaza, a baby in China. That is the spiritual and moral force behind our voices coming together.
As a Yemeni Canadian, I call on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to end the $15 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia. The arms manufactured in my hometown of London, Ontario, are used to oppress civilians in Yemen. President Biden, you unjustly entered this war back in 2015. It's now your responsibility to end all forms of support for this war and to remove all barriers to humanitarian assistance, including lifting the blockade on Yemen.
And we should end our support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen.